So the South African government has not yet given up hope that it can negotiate a better trade deal with the US administration. President Donald Trump intends to push ahead at the end of this week with the introduction of a 30% tariff on South African goods going into the American market. Let's talk now about this with political economist and executive director at PESA, Sia Biniza. Sia, very good evening to you. Good to have you on the SABC. So, as I was saying, South Africa is still optimistic that a deal can be struck with Washington, but I wonder, at this stage, is that still a worthy pursuit?
Hi, good evening, Timmy. Yes, indeed. Look, I think the South African government is stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, the US as a market for our investments is not something that we can ignore, at around 7.5% of our total exports. And in nominal terms, in 2024, we exported around $8.2 billion to the US. So this is actually hurting South Africa much more than it is hurting the US. Even if you look at the US's intentions around balancing the trade deficit with South Africa only constitutes around 0.25% of the US imports. And so it is still a noble cause on the part of South Africa because we've got 8.2 billion in physical exports to account for. However, I do think that South Africa is really a victim, as they say, when the elephants fight, the grass really suffers. Because I think really this trade war is between the US and China ostensibly, and whatever smaller countries like South Africa are really the grass that suffers in this instance.
On the point about China then, in the briefing today by the Ministers of International Relations as well as Trade and Industry, we learned that in terms of trying to diversify South Africa's economic or trade options, doing more business with China or tapping further into the Chinese market is also being explored by Pretoria. And I wonder how that might further complicate the dynamic with Washington. Might it annoy Donald Trump further?
Indeed. Look, it's quite a challenging time, really, that our trade negotiation has at the moment, mainly because there's such a dynamic, always changing environment, which makes it complicated to negotiate. However, I do think that Pretoria has, I think, the right approach. Government is really taking a principled approach in how we're dealing with this, I think, negotiation fallout. One that prioritizes our commitment to regional integration, and regional integration is critical for our own, not just diversification of our export markets, but sustainability. What we saw through COVID and other financial crises was that the regional integration ties are across Africa, and our intra-Africa trade was a way that we were able to remain resilient in spite of the external shocks. And so whilst government is still continuing the diplomatic negotiations with the US and also looking for new markets, however, it's grounded, I think, in a commitment to regional integration and SAC being at the core of that, because the tariffs against South Africa create a difficult context in the Southern African Customs Union because other countries have lower tariffs, and that could create an incentive for re-export through the region. But nonetheless, South Africa continues to be committed to regional integration, which is important for our resilience. You cannot ignore the fast-growing markets in Asia and the Middle East, however. And this is precisely where I think government is trying to leverage off our membership to BRICS in order to tap into those markets, because in the absence of the US market or trying to fill that gap, that is the next best option.
And can countries like South Africa then, given just how much product we sell to the US, can this country afford to call the US's bluff, as the Chinese did, in fact, at the beginning of the crafting, if you will, of this global trade tariffs package by Trump? I think it was about 3 months ago already.
Yes, look, South Africa is in no position to call the Trump a bluff or play chicken, as it were. I think the only economy that's got leverage against the US has got to be China. I mean, not even the US's allies in the European Union or even Japan has been able to kind of call the bluff or maintain their leverage in order to sweeten their deal.
Right.
If you look at some of the deals that the Trump administration came out with in the European Union and Japan over the last week, they were severely hit as well. And so South Africa is definitely not in a position to play chicken with the US, especially given the significant chunk of around 8 billion, as I mentioned, in exports that we have at risk. But also the challenge is that I think a large chunk of that, which is where the jobs are, is in vehicles, which is not easy to kind of replace, as it were, for items such as fruits, for example, and other items which we could easily find new markets for. It is a difficult thing to replace given the inelastic demand curves associated with the vehicles and manufactured products in general.
So we were able to get, just lastly, Sia, today, a sense of what government intends to do to cushion local industry from the effects of these tariffs, should they kick in at 30% at the end of this week. Among them, this export support desk that's going to be established, a localization fund support mechanism. Is that enough cushioning?
Sure. Look, I think really government, and I think they've got the right approach, is playing a sort of wait and see game. I do think that the Trump administration will loosen up on some of the tariffs because they simply just don't have much of an economic impact in closing the trade deficit once they've reached an agreement with China. And so whilst somebody may question some of the interventions such as the export desk and the competitiveness desk, which I think are really existing tools that government is providing to exporters as being insufficient in response, but you also don't want to make so much of an extreme response that you destabilize or disrupt or result in, adverse market selection in the economy as a result of support measures that skew the markets. And so I do think that it's sufficient for now. It does give, I think, some support to exporters, which will be hit hardest by the shocks. But I think as long as government can hold out until the point where China and the US reach a trade deal, then I think the Trump administration is likely to ease some of the tariff responses to the rest of the world.
Sia Biniza, really good to talk to you. Sia is a political economist as well as executive director at PESA.